Good morning. And thank you for joining us for the 9th Underhill Lecture in Spirituality held at Boston College. I'm happy to announce that this lecture is being videotaped by the Boston College Church in the 21st Century Initiative, and it's going to be available as one of the 2009 front row offerings in about 3 to 4 weeks. This lecture is named after the early 20th century mystic, Evelyn Underhill, whose dates were 1875 to 1941. She was a married laywoman in ministry who was both the first woman to give a series of theological lectures at Oxford and the first to become a retreat leader in the Anglican Church. Widely recognized for her classic text Mysticism, a comprehensive study of religious experience, Underhill authored numerous influential works on the Christian spiritual life. This morning, we have the privilege to have with us a 21st century figure who resembles Underhill in significant ways. Timothy Radcliffe is a person of intellect, a person of deep faith, an author, a spiritual leader, someone passionate about laying solid foundations for the practice of spirituality. A Catholic priest and Dominican friar, Radcliffe is the only member of the English province of the Dominicans to have held the office of Master of the Order of Preachers since the order's foundation. He held this office from 1992 to 2001. Prior to serving in this capacity, Radcliffe was prior provincial of the Dominicans in England. Timothy Radcliffe is the author of many works that reflect the intersection of spirituality, justice, and ecclesial life. His publications include the titles Sing a New Song, The Christian Vocation, I Call You Friends, 7 Last Words, Why Go to Church? The Drama of the Eucharist, and What is the Point of Being a Christian?, for which he was awarded the Michael Ramsey Prize for Theological Writing in 2007. Radcliffe has been patron of the International Young Leaders Network, a project of the University of Oxford, and he has helped to launch the Las Casas Institute of Ethics, Governance, and Social Justice. Please join me in welcoming this influential lecturer, author, and spiritual leader who will be speaking to us this morning on a spirituality for the 21st century, beyond the ghetto and assimilation. Timothy Radcliffe.
Thank you very much, Tom and Colleen, for your nice, warm Irish welcome. It always does good for an Englishman to receive kind words from the Irish like that. Although I was reminded of the first time I went to Ecuador. You could probably tell Tom was Irish by his Spanish pronunciation. The first time I went to Ecuador, the bishop welcomed me with a beautiful speech, all about how difficult it must be for the Irish to be persecuted through the centuries by those terrible English people, until his secretary whispered a little word in his ear, when the bishop became extremely embarrassed. And so when I stood up to make a reply, and my Spanish was just beginning like Tom's, I said, El obispo está embarazado, which I thought meant the bishop is embarrassed, but actually meant the bishop is pregnant. Which he wasn't. As far as I know, anyway. Please forgive me if I get a bit confused. I took off from Sydney, Australia on the 6th of July, 9 hours in front of British time, and I landed the same day, a bit earlier, in Los Angeles, 6 hours, 9 hours behind English time. So I've really rather lost, and my body doesn't know where it is. So if I get a bit confused, I haven't been knocking back the Jameson. That comes later. Not that I'm dropping a hint, Tom, you know. I feel terribly honored to be asked to give the Evelyn Underhill Lecture this year. And because it's in her honor, Tom said I had to talk about spirituality. Now, I have to make a confession today, after all the lovely things Colleen was saying. I grew up as a young Dominican being a bit suspicious of spirituality. You know, spirituality was the sort of thing that those Jesuits go in for. My next-door neighbor for 30 years and my beloved brother, Herbert McCabe, always used to say, I love the Jesuits, only I wouldn't want my daughter to marry one. So I feel a slight bit of a fraud, you know, giving this lecture on the spirituality of the 21st century. But I console myself, as I do when I give most of my lectures, by remembering one of my brethren who gave a lecture in Chicago. And at the end, when he sat down, the applause was rather tepid. So he turned to the person beside him and he said, I hope it wasn't that bad, was it? And the man said, oh, I don't blame you at all. I don't blame you. I just blame the people who asked you to speak in the first place. So blame Tom. It's hard to sketch a spirituality for a world that's coming to be. As Tom said, 40 years ago, when we were still modern and using typewriters and so on, the expectation was that religion was in the process of disappearing. When I was a student, John Lennon used to sing, imagine there's no heaven, it's easy if you try. And it seemed to get easier and easier. And really none of us had any expectation that at the beginning of the 21st century, religion would be back in a big way, often in a rather violent fundamentalist form. All over the world, we see violence between religious believers. And this has provoked, at least in Europe, an angry hostility against God. You see books like Dawkins, The God Delusion, Christopher Hitchens, God is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything, selling in vast numbers. I went to the Sydney airport bookshop when I was waiting to board, and I'd like to deny that I wanted to check up whether they got my books. And there was a big section on spirituality, over 100 titles. What was interesting was that only one of them was not either anti-Christian or non-Christian. Among all those 100 books, there was only one book which is vaguely, I could say, favorable to Christianity, and that was A Life of Mother Teresa. So you get a lot of interest in spirituality, you get a lot of thirst for God, you get a lot of aggression against Christianity, and above all, perhaps, a great deal of ignorance as to what our faith might mean. Terry Eagleton said that Dawkins' critique of religion is so ill-informed, it's like rejecting feminism on the basis of Clint Eastwood's opinions about it. And I suspect that even in America, often there is a profound ignorance of the tradition from which we come. I heard of a kid the other day who expressed his astonishment that churches were open on a Sunday. He thought we were against that sort of thing. And in Australia, somebody told me about a girl who came bouncing up, full of enthusiasm. She said, you know, I've just discovered that Jesus died on Good Friday. Isn't that a beautiful coincidence, she said. So for Christianity to flourish, in this really interesting climate where you have interest, thirst, aggression, ignorance, I have to say that spirituality on its own isn't enough. Spirituality originally meant simply the Christian life, the life of a baptized Christian. And until the end of the Middle Ages, there were no separate disciplines of theology, ethics, biblical study, spirituality, and so on. There was simply Christian life, which is moral, reflective, prayerful, and imaginative. But what you see during the 14th century is that this original dynamic unity is beginning to come apart. And I think that that's one of the reasons for the growth of secularism. So that theology, apart from spirituality and ethics, tends to become dry and arid. The sort of narrow scholasticism against which those early Jesuits reacted so strongly. When I arrived at LA and the immigration officer asked me what I taught, and I said theology, he said, the heavy stuff. The heavy stuff. But ethics or morality detached from spirituality and theology tends to become moralistic about what's forbidden and what's permitted. And spirituality, if it becomes attached from theology and ethics, tends to become warm and woolly. And then you end up by hugging trees. So I think that the challenge of the 21st century is to find a new synthesis of all those aspects of the Christian life. For Thomas Aquinas, I have to mention him in every lecture, as you know, the one who greater than whom cannot be conceived. For Aquinas, praying, being silent in the presence of God, studying, and trying to be virtuous, they were all inseparable dimensions of the journey, the life of a Christian. And what I would dream of for a Christian university like Boston College is that you would help us find again a dynamic synthesis of the Christian life. I grew up in a sort of Catholic subculture that was simultaneously confident and open. They knew we were Catholics. You know, we didn't eat meat on a Friday. On Ash Wednesday, we got smudges on our foreheads or on our nose because the aim of the parish priest wasn't very good. Good Friday, the men wore black ties and the women wore mourning. We lived in a religious world. The saints were our friends. We saw the world in terms of gratitude, blessing, the promise of happiness. But it wasn't an enclosed, narrow, obsessive little ghetto. We loved food and drink and sport. We were open to other people's culture. Many of our friends weren't Catholic or Christian. So it was a culture that I would say was confident, alive, religious, but open beyond itself. And I think that that's the sort of culture we need, a Christian living, if Christianity is to flourish in the 21st century. And that means avoiding two dead ends. The first is that of the ghetto, is to retreat into an enclosed Christian or Catholic world, cut off. Tom Monahan, the founder and owner of Domino Pizzas, has founded a Catholic village by his Catholic university, Ave Maria, where people will be able to grow up making Catholic friends and having Catholic values and marrying other Catholics. And I can quite understand why that is a very attractive option. During the Dark Ages, it was the monasteries that kept alive the faith in a hostile world. Today we're celebrating the feast of St. Benedict. And Alistair MacIntyre, in his great book, After Virtue, at the end he concludes by saying that this is a time when we need another St. Benedict. We need these oases, you might say, of Christian life. But if they become ghettos, enclosed, walled off, then Christianity will die. Because we will betray that openness, that hospitality of Jesus to everybody, beginning in his case with the prostitutes and the tax collectors, the despised. But the other dead end that we have to reject is that of assimilation, disappearing down the secular plug hole, becoming invisible. You know, we might talk about Jesus, say that he is generally a rather good thing, but not too loudly. This has been the challenge for Judaism for centuries. How to avoid the ghetto and assimilation. The chief rabbi of Great Britain, a wonderful man called Jonathan Sacks, wrote a very moving little book called Shall We Have Jewish Grandchildren? And that's a question, I think, for you. Shall we have Christian grandchildren? At least as a priest, I don't have any grandchildren, so that's one less thing to worry about. I was trying to think a bit about these issues for the centenary edition of America when I looked out of my window at Blackfriars in Oxford and I saw this beautiful white beam tree beginning to put out its leaves. And it seemed a perfect image of vibrant life. Now, for that tree to flourish, it had to be white beam through and through. That unity of life about which I talked, an arboreal unity. Otherwise, it would die. But secondly, it flourished at its tips. The roots probe down into the ground. The leaves open out into the air, the sun, the wind, the rain, and the occasional splodge of bird droppings. The tree is alive in itself, but open to what isn't itself, to that wider environment. Now, I think that if Christianity is to flourish in the 21st century, we need to be like that tree, a very traditional image, of course, for the church, which is to say with an integrated Christian life, which is reflective, theological, imaginative, spiritual, prayerful, ethical. But we will only be alive if we are open beyond ourselves to what is not Christian. Dynamic interaction. Now let us take the doctrine of the Trinity. You might imagine the doctrine of the Trinity is the great trunk of the tree, its roots burying down into the deep soil of tradition. This is the doctrine which we proclaim in our creed. This is the doctrine into which we are baptized. Faith in Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Though I cannot help remembering one of my brethren, who's called Cardinal Michael Brown. When he was a child, in danger of death, he was baptized in emergency by a nun. And when he was an old man, filled with glory, ex-master of the order, ex-master of the sacred palace, personal theologian to the Pope, a cardinal, he tracked down that ancient nun to thank her. And she said, Your Eminence, it was a great honor for me to have baptized you in the name of Jesus, Mary, and Joseph. Suddenly he thought I haven't been baptized. I'm not a priest. I'm not even a cardinal. Ever since the Enlightenment, Western society has nurtured a deep prejudice against doctrine. Doctrine is doctrinaire. Dogma is dogmatic. And for the 18th century thinkers who formed the culture of modernity, which, as Tom said, we are now leaving behind us, they believed themselves to be enlightened precisely because they'd cast off the shackles of doctrine, by which they meant Catholic dogma, above all, the doctrine of the Trinity and the teaching of Aristotle. Unless you had the courage to work things out for yourself, think for yourself, then you were only a child. Nicholas Lash from the other Cambridge wrote, "The Enlightenment left us with what we might call a crisis of docility. Unless we have the courage to work things out for ourselves, to take as true only that which we have personally attained or perhaps invented, then meanings and values and descriptions and instructions imposed by other people, feeding other people's power, will enslave us, bind us into fables and falsehoods from the past. Even God's truth, perhaps especially God's truth, is no exception to this. Only slaves and children should be teachable, docile." What I want to suggest to you today as a first step in trying to imagine a spirituality of the 21st century is that the doctrine of the Trinity is the most exciting thing that we have to offer our contemporaries. But that this doctrine is alive, vital, only insofar as it is in dynamic contact with what our contemporaries think and feel and love and live. Otherwise, it's dead. Now, the doctrine of the Trinity may seem the most remote and obscure of all Christian doctrines. Preachers dread having to preach on that day. We can only communicate our faith in the doctrine, I would argue, through conversation. Indeed, the very word homily comes from a Greek word meaning conversation. All preaching is conversation. And this is especially true when we are preaching the doctrine of the Trinity, because the Trinity is the eternal, equal, loving conversation of the Father and the Son, which is the Holy Spirit. And that's why the Trinity draws near to us in the man Jesus, who is a man of conversation. The whole of John's Gospel, from the very beginning, is the conversations he holds with people. Starting with the disciples, with Nicodemus who comes in the night, with the Samaritan woman at the well, with the blind man born blind. Everybody else talks about him. Jesus talks to him and with him. The great last discourse, which is one long conversation, the conversation with Pilate, which ends in the silence of death. And then the resurrection, which is the resumption of the conversation with Mary Magdalene in the garden. You can only preach the doctrine of the Trinity in a mutually respectful, loving, open conversation. And any good conversation takes you beyond familiar ground. It takes you in unexpected directions. Every conversation leads to conversion of everybody. Pierre Claverie, the Dominican Bishop of Oran in Algeria, gave his whole life for dialogue with Islam. Now, some people would say, you should, rather than dialogue, we should preach the gospel. But what we see is this is a false dichotomy. But what Pierre realized was that those conversations always led to the conversion of everybody, in the first place of himself, as he learned to discover the face of Christ in his Muslim brothers and sisters. It also led to their conversion. For some, it took the form of the conversion of those Muslims who became Christians at great risk to their lives, known to each other only by the code words, I am a brother or a sister of Augustine. For others, it took the form of becoming better Muslims. It's in God's hands how grace works. We're not in control. When I went to Pierre's funeral 2 days after his assassination by fundamentalists, we had to stand up, some of us at the end, and give our testimony. And a young woman stood up and she said, I returned to the faith of my ancestors, Islam, because of Pierre. Pierre was my bishop. Pierre was the bishop of the Muslims. And you heard throughout the great crowd of Muslims in the cathedral for his funeral, you heard this sea of sound. And I asked what they were saying, and they were all saying, Pierre was our bishop. Pierre was the bishop of the Muslims. So what you see is that conversation is always conversion. But you don't know where it will lead you, because you never know where the study of God will lead you. Usually, our ways of thinking are deeply dualistic. Day and night, good and bad, black and white, male, female, body, soul, earth, sky. Often these dualisms signify the oppositions which give us identity, us, them, right, wrong, Republican, Democrat, left, right, Jesuit, Dominican. Our politics, our sport, our love affairs, our antagonisms are usually dualistic. But to be caught up in a Trinitarian love is to be found yourself carried beyond all these small oppositions. Because we find ourselves in the love of the Father for the Son, and the Son for the Father, which isn't introverted, which is the Holy Spirit, carrying us into a new world, fruitful beyond itself. So the doctrine of the Trinity is given not just in what we inherited from our ancestors, from the Eastern Fathers, from Augustine, from Aquinas. This is the deep soil into which our roots burrow. But it's alive as we engage in conversation with anybody who can teach us anything about the love and the joy and the pain of loving. St. Augustine said, show me a lover and he will know what I'm talking about. From the moment that an adolescent teenager has their first crush on the gym teacher, he or she is beginning their long study of the doctrine of the Trinity. And parents try to raise their children into an equal adult love without domination, an unpatriarchal love. They are exploring the Trinity. And the doctrine of the Trinity is always surprising, because it's an invitation to share the life of the God who said, behold, I make all things new. To find yourself caught up into the life of that God is to meet the one who is younger, fresher, more alive than we ever are. Aquinas said that our God is actus purus, pure act. Aquinas explores the idea that maybe the word God is more a verb than a noun. Utter activity. So any static, frozen doctrine of the Trinity is necessarily a betrayal. It's what Karl Rahner called the heresy of dead orthodoxy. One of my brethren was wandering through the slums of Lima recently, wondering about the meaning of life as one does. And he came across a couple of kids playing jacks. Do you play jacks in the United States, where you throw the ball in the air and you've got to amass as many jacks as you can, then catch it on the way down? And he was astonished by their laughter, their vitality, their joy as they played the game of jacks. Only the astonishing thing was that there was no ball. They didn't have a ball. And he said that really evoked for him the eternal, spontaneous creativity of our God, making everything out of nothing. And this freshness, this dynamism can only be suggested imaginatively. What principally, I think, threatens our understanding of the doctrine of the Trinity isn't science. It's a dulling of the imagination where we suppress the hints of the transcendence. It's a sort of scientific literalism, which most great scientists escape, of course. It's the dull flatness of consumerism, which reduces everything to one color, that of the dollar. For the Jesuit poet Jared Manley Hopkins, the world was charged with the grandeur of God. It will flame out like shining from shook foil. But for Hopkins, that radiance was being dimmed by industrial Britain. For all is seared with trade, bleared, smeared with toil, and wears man's smudge and shares man's smell. The soil is bare now, nor can foot feel being shod. So Trinitarian theology, like the leaves, the leaves at the end of the tree, is only alive in so much as it's open to all those people who are creatively exploring the pains and the joys of love, regardless of whether they're Christian or not. The novelists, I think of Niall Williams, great Irish novelist, who I think understands the deceits and the joy of love better than anybody. On the plane on my way out here, on my way from Singapore to Sydney, I saw again that wonderful film, The Children of a Lesser God. Have any of you seen it? Which is the story about a man who goes to teach in a school for the deaf. And he falls in love with this incredibly beautiful young woman who has never said a word, who's enclosed in silence. And there's this incredible moment where she signs to him, "Until you let me be an eye as you are an eye, I cannot let you enter my silence and know me." And I leapt up and I thought, yes, that's it. I ran back and I found an air hostess. I said, "Have you got a pen and paper, please?" Tears streaming down my face. She probably thought, here's another drunk nutter. There was a young poet in Krakow called Karol Wojtyła, who was known as a playwright, an imaginative thinker. And when the primate of Poland, Cardinal Wojtyła, was looking for a new auxiliary bishop of Krakow, he put Wojtyła at the bottom of the list. He said, "I don't need a man with his head in the clouds. I want somebody with political savvy who's going to fight the communists." And for exactly the same reason, the communists put Wojtyła at the top of their list. But what they did not understand was that Wojtyła believed in what he called the theater or the poetry of resistance. And that it is only in speaking a richer language, more imaginatively alive, that he could oppose communism. They always say, you know why Wojtyła won? Because he spoke a better Polish than his opponents. He offered a rich, imaginative world in which people could flourish. In the face of that, communism just collapsed. Or your own Dorothy Day, whose life was founded, she said, on the teachings of Jesus and the reading of novels. When Dorothy Day was an old woman nearing her end, she said, I'd like people to say she really loved those books. That's the meaning of my life, to live by the moral vision of the church and some of the favorite writers. Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Gorky. Take those artists and novelists to heart and live by their wisdom. So the real, I think, opponent, the enemy of faith is banality, the prosaic, the platitudinous. And anyone who opens our imagination is our ally in the search of the ever-living triune God. Now, imaginative, creative, exploratory people will often not be sure what they believe. They may have an ambiguous relationship to our Orthodox faith, reservations, doubts, questions. But it is with these searchers that we must be in conversation. Tom Bedoin of Fordham University wrote beautifully of the irreverent spiritual quest of Generation X. He's written, explored really interestingly the spirituality of people like Madonna. He said, we search for faith in the midst of profound theological, social, personal, and sexual ambiguities. Don't go there unless you're brave. But I think, and I've said often, I think that is the greatest challenge for Christianity in the 21st century is courage to overthrow timidity. Now, if the great tree that is to flourish, that is the church, if it's to flourish, it must have its roots deep down in the tradition, but it must be alive in the leaves, open outside. And for that, we need the faithful questioner. And the faithful questioner is quite a different person from the Enlightenment skeptic. You see, the Enlightenment skeptic stood on the outside, dispassionately watching. He, nearly always a he, looking through the microscope, observing, skeptically. Now, that sort of approach was absolutely necessary for the evolution of contemporary science, for which we all give thanks. But if it becomes the way that we regard each other, then it is corrosive of faith and community. I remember when I was provincial, there was a member of the council who always used to sit silently during our impassioned discussions, saying nothing, looking at us all suspiciously. And when we had arrived at a conclusion and voted, he would always say, this discussion has been badly conducted from the beginning. I will have nothing to do with your conclusion. I used to get crazy. Now, that's quite different, you see, from the faithful questioner who's deeply embodied in the community, who belongs. Think of those who made our theology alive in the last century. Yves Congar, Marie-Dominique Chenu, Henri de Lubac, Karl Rahner. These Jesuits and Dominicans, as it happens, were the leaves of the theological tree precisely because they were utterly implanted in the church, embedded in their religious orders. It's no coincidence that they were all religious, the ones I mentioned. When Congar wondered how he could endure humiliation, being silenced, sent to England, what on earth was he going to eat? He said, how can I endure? And he said, c'est le fait des frères, enfin. It's the fact of brothers. So our faithful questioners, searching, posing the hard questions, we must never leave them isolated, even when we disagree with them. Otherwise, the leaf will drop off and we'll lose its nourishment. But I think that even that's not enough, the support of a community. For the faithful questioner to endure in his or her theological searching, to endure the sun and the rain and the bird droppings, they need to be both virtuous and spiritual. You need that integrity of the spiritual, theological, moral life. And this means that a new theology requires of us a new ethics, and this is going to be incredibly abbreviated. You see, ethics, since the Enlightenment, has usually been seen in terms of what we are obliged or permitted to do. In A Secular Age by Charles Taylor, he explores the growth of what he calls the culture of control, which you didn't have in the Middle Ages. It had all the checks and balances of a healthy society. But beginning in the 16th, 17th century, you see the evolution of a culture of control, the rise of absolute monarchs like Henry VIII, who would take control of the church. You see the evolution of the state, claiming more and more power, the locking up of the poor, who aren't any longer seen as our brothers and sisters in Christ. They're seen as a menace, the mob, a threat. The locking up of the mentally ill, what Michel Foucault calls the great locking up. You see the explosion of slavery. Slavery really taking off at the beginning of the Enlightenment. Very characteristic of that culture's search for absolute control. The establishment of the police, standing armies, health and safety, the obsession with health and safety as a recent manifestation. I came across a book called Who Wants a Dragon?, which is about a little cuddly pink dragon who used to toast his marshmallows with his fiery breath. The publishers required it to be rewritten since fire-breathing dragons are against health and safety. Now, in this culture of control, the church should be an oasis of freedom. But it often isn't. Often we've been infected by the same culture of control, which is in fact the fruit of secularism. You see, once you cease to believe passionately in God, you've got to take over running the world. So I think the challenge for the church is to recover its inheritance of freedom. Now, in this culture of control, morality is increasingly seen as the regulation of our behavior. It's, if you want, an arm of the culture of control. But if the church is to flourish, we need a new moral vision. What I think would be a recovery of the ethics of virtue. Because the virtues are not primarily about what you're allowed to do or forbidden to do, but who you are called to become, who you're called to be a person who is just and courageous and honorable and truthful and one who finds his or her happiness in God. Of course, we may need the Ten Commandments at sort of an initial stage, though I sympathize with Bertrand Russell, who said that they should be treated as an examination paper. Nobody should attempt more than 6. But in our tradition, the Ten Commandments were never about the external control of behavior. They were more about finding your identity in God, who summons us to freedom from Egypt and into friendship. It said in the Bible, he spoke to God as a friend. The Ten Commandments were the invitation to friendship with God. I was talking to the chief rabbi shortly before I began this crazy trip around the world, and he pointed out, which I'd never known before, that in Hebrew, there is no word for obey in our modern sense of an external constraint. There are only words for to listen, words that relate to personal relationship. He said that when the State of Israel was established in 1949, they had, for the first time in Hebrew, to find a word to mean obey. And they had to take an Aramaic word because they didn't have one in their own language. Now, where have we got to? So these 10 words, this Decalogue, summons us into friendship. If I wanted to murder my brother, the guy who lives next door to me at Blackfriars, young Dominican, 23 years old, full of enthusiasm, and a great slammer of doors. And you know, sometimes I want to murder him. And then I remember, thou shalt not murder, thou shalt not kill. I hope that I don't see that as an external constraint. You know, I'd really rather love to murder Greg, only unfortunately it's not allowed. But more as a summons to remember who I am, which is his brother, and therefore somebody who doesn't want to murder him much. So to be a faithful searcher, embedded in the community, but open beyond it, you need a life of virtue to become someone who rejoices in the truth, who spontaneously seeks the good. Otherwise, you may find yourself tempted to become a victim, a celebrity. Terrible temptation. Many of my brethren, when I met them, they would say, has Cardinal Ratzinger condemned me yet, please? I said, I'm afraid not. Oh, drat. You have to find ways of resisting telling your story with yourself as the hero, which may earn you a lot of money by selling your books and appearing on television. A friend of Pope Pius IX once went to him and he said, Your Holiness, would you be very kind and write a preface for my book? And the Pope said, but why? And he said, because it would sell more copies. And the Pope replied, in which case I can do much better. I'll put it on the index of forbidden books. You have to become somebody who is prudent in the original sense. That doesn't mean cautious. Somebody who lives in the real world and knows when to speak and what to say. Somebody who's courageous, which means, Aquinas says, knowing how to endure suffering with joy. You will need to become temperate, particularly if you've had a bad day and you want several whiskeys at the end of the evening. You need to become somebody who finds their joy in God. The virtues form you for a truthful love. Yves Congar said, I have loved the truth, as I have loved a person. And to be a patient, faithful searcher requires immense humility. One seeks the truth. It's not important that it's my truth that wins, but that the truth is disclosed. And it might not be that I am right. Congar wrote in the middle of the crisis in 1954, he said, to speak the truth prudently, without useless or provocative scandal, but to remain and become more and more an authentic and pure witness to what is true. And when one of the brethren asked him, but Eve, are your answers right? He said, I don't know, but the questions are. The questions are. So we see how to be, if you want a leaf of the tree, a faithful, patient, humble searcher, you require a life. Get a life. As people say, get a life. A life which is spiritual, reflective, imaginative, moral. And perhaps it above all requires that deep spirituality of patience. It takes time for us to arrive at the truth. Trees take centuries to grow. The doctrine of the Trinity, the Nicene Creed, takes the same time as it takes a good English oak to mature. Cardinal Newman said, a Christian is someone who waits for Christ. The Latin word for wait, attendere, suggests an active waiting, an attentiveness, ears open, eyes peeled. And Christianity will flourish if we dare to raise questions to which we do not know the answers, and we may die before we arrive at them. Now, I think we need some such organization as the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith to keep us steady as we search. But I believe its function should not be to slap down theologians when they ask questions, but to stop premature answers, to keep open the debate as we pray and think and search. It should keep alive the questions when lots of people want to shut them down. It should keep alive what G.K. Chesterton called the adventure of orthodoxy. Because once it stops being an adventure, it stops being orthodox. As T.S. Eliot said, the faith and the love and the hope are all in the waiting. Wait without thought, for you're not ready for thought. So the darkness shall be the light, and the stillness the dancing. So what we need to wrap it all up for the 21st century is a spirituality which is profoundly theological and virtuous. Because it's only that integrated Christian living that will make us strong enough to be both confident and open. And that means a doctrine which flourishes in dialogue, and a moral vision which is that of the pilgrim on the way to the kingdom. And then we will be a tree which is strong enough to welcome all the odd birds that want to come and nest in our branches. What is the kingdom of God like? And to what shall I compare it? It's like a grain of mustard seed which someone took and sowed in his garden, and it grew, and it became a tree, and the birds of the air made nests in its branches. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Timothy. The applause speaks of our appreciation. I couldn't help but think of the wonderful line of Catherine Lacuna, that marvelous theologian that for many of us, at least in North America, was the person who brought us back to the centrality of the Trinity in our faith. She had a lovely way of saying it. We used to say that the Trinity is a mystery that we cannot explain. And of course, that's true. It's still a mystery that we cannot explain, but now it's the mystery that explains everything. Beautiful. Thank you. We're going to take a few moments. Let me give you a little direction. We're going to invite you to stand and stretch, but first, think about this. As you stretch, turn to a neighbor and have a chat. Now, if you don't feel like talking to your neighbor, don't bother. But listen to the neighbor. Are you willing to listen, just to listen to the neighbor? Stand, stretch, and say, well, what did you think? And what did you hear? And what did you like? What did you not like? Is there a wisdom you want to take away? A question maybe you'd like to pose to Timothy? Or an answer you'd like to offer to the rest of us? Whatever. Whatever the Spirit suggests to you. Let's stand. Let's take 5. And then we'll regather for some final closing conversation with Timothy. We'll come together again, if we may. Well, what we'd like to invite at this time, for about another 25 minutes or so, is some ongoing further conversation with Timothy. And we welcome you to bring your comments, questions, observations, wisdoms, or whatever to the community. The acoustics are a little daunting in here, but I think if you speak loudly, I do think everybody will hear, and if not, I will try to repeat the comment or the question. And so I think this should work. Who would like to get the ball rolling? If you would stand, I think, rather than putting up your hand, that might be yourself. Go ahead. Thank you.
You started the session...
Good and loudly, if you could, and maybe talk out to the whole community.
You started a session with a line by John Lennon. Now I'm just spontaneously seeking the good in that, but do you think that he was trying to get rid of the dualistic life when he said no heaven above, no hell below?
That's a very interesting question. You wouldn't like to give us a rendition of the song, would you? I think that what happened is that for very many people, the images of heaven and hell derived from a very infantile image of God as the really powerful person, you know? And particularly in the 19th century, when they forgot the good, healthy, negative theology of Aquinas, who said we're joined to God as to the unknown, God became increasingly a very powerful person, usually a very powerful invisible man, a sort of super celestial, universal, invisible president of the United States. And with that image of God, liberty, freedom, really meant getting rid of God, because it was an oppressive figure. And for me to be free, I had to be liberated from that God and his threat of hell and promise of heaven. And that's why I think that in the 19th century, actually, that was the great time for atheism, because it was exciting. It promised freedom from this oppressive, dominative God. What happened in the 20th century was a complex story, but we began actually to see what happens in godless societies. You see what happens with Mao Zedong and Pol Pot and Stalin and Hitler. You see that actually the godless world is one in which humanity is crushed, leads to the killing fields. I think with the people like the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, and more recently people like Radiohead and so on, what you have is an exploratory stage with a lot of ambiguity, as Tom Bowdoin says in his interesting little book. A lot of ambiguity, trying to play with ideas. Imagine there's no heaven. It's easy if you try. But I think also John Lennon was actually somebody who's very interested in religion, as indeed were all the Beatles and most contemporary people interested in pop music. It's a very interesting world, I think. So they got beyond, I think, that raw, militant atheism of the 19th century. And they're more in an exploratory stage today. And where it'll take us, we're not quite sure. We're still haunted by the image of God as the policeman. There's this advert campaign on buses in Britain, which I meant to quote. If you wander away from the lectern, you always leave out the best bits. And the adverts say, "Don't worry, God probably doesn't exist. Now, stop worrying and enjoy yourself." See, that's all about liberation from the universal policeman in the sky. And I think what we have to do is to offer our contemporaries the incredible liberation of a God who actually desires our happiness and invites us to share God's own freedom. So I suggested we should put up an advert which said, "God does exist. Now stop worrying, relax, and enjoy yourself."
Thank you. Somebody just told me that my colleague John Chade, that there are microphones there. So maybe if you go to the microphone and line up, and while somebody is getting in line, I just love hearing Timothy quote Tom Bowdoin. Was one of my doctoral students. I always said Bowdoin would make me famous, so it's wonderful that he's finally getting his recognition. One of our graduates here from Boston College. Yourself, thank you.
Thank you for your great presentation. Thank you for referencing Radiohead, big fan.
If I may just drop in a little thing, I had dinner the other day with a man called Colin. And at the end of dinner, I said, "Well, what do you do?" And he said, "I'm the drummer for Radiohead." And I went home and I was having dinner with my nephews and nieces, and I said, "I had dinner with the drummer from a band called Radiohead. Have you ever heard of them?" And they said, "Wow, for the first time I got the respect of my nephews and nieces."
Anyway, I was interested in finding out what you would think would be the relevant questions to ask. Here we are in the year of the priest. What questions have to be asked of us, pointing towards the ones that have been, quote, shut down, the answers that have been shut down? What do we need to ask in light of this celebration for the next year, so to speak, to get back to the roots of priesthood, to expand the branches, as it were? What are your thoughts on that, Father?
I think that there was a lovely little article by a man called Father Tony Philpott. Tony is probably about the best-known diocesan priest in Britain. works at the English College in Rome, greatly respected, and appointed as spiritual director by the bishops of England and Wales for the seminarians. And he wrote very beautifully about the priest's vocation to live between what he calls the rock and the hard place. To live between, if you want, the inherited tradition with all its richness, and to really know it and love it, but to also inhabit the questions and the doubts and the puzzlement of our contemporaries. And he said it's very hard to live in that place between, if you want, the world of orthodoxy and the world of doubt and question and search. He said it's very hard to live there. That is the pain and the joy of the diocesan priesthood. He said, if that's where you're living, you will probably be a good priest. Now, I think if the priest is to live there, you need a lot of mutual support. You need communion, and I mentioned that in the talk. You need, I think, so often priests are solitary figures. They need the community of the presbyterate. They need the community of their parish. They need to be embedded in networks of love and support that give confidence. I think the greatest crisis for the church at the moment, as I've said a few times in the last couple of days, is courage. We're terribly timid. And I love the word confidence, which comes from confidens, to believe with. And sometimes I may need you to believe with me, for me, when I'm struggling to believe. But sometimes I may need to believe for you when you're struggling. So I think we need networks that give us courage. Now, when things are painful, and I have the impression that in the United States at the moment, this is in some ways a very painful moment for the church. The great danger is that we become fragmented and therefore lonely and unconfident. And so it's very easy for lay people to blame the priests. Look at that wretched guy, you know. Look at how inadequate his sermons are. Look at how inadequate he is humanly. And for the priests to do that for the bishops, and the bishops, when nobody's hearing, do it about the Vatican. So we all blame everybody else, instead of actually finding ways that we give courage to each other. And that also means entering the doubts and the questions of others, even when they're not your own. I think one of the things that we need from priests today is they mustn't be party political men. In a church which is more polarized in the United States than anywhere else in the world, with the exception of some parts of Latin America, the great temptation is for the priests to see themselves as a party political figure, hammering people who are on the wrong side. You get some bishops who do this too, party political figures. And I think what you need is priests and bishops and lay people and religious who reach across the divisions of ideological polarization and refuse to accept them. It's my belief that the polarization of progressive and conservative, these are categories of the Enlightenment. They're not Catholic categories. Any Catholic who identifies themselves as being progressive to the exclusion of the traditionalists, or the other way around, is as if we're cutting off half their identity. We are necessarily people who are rooted in the tradition and open to the kingdom of God. So I think one thing I would hope of priests in this year of the priests is to be people who've got large enough hearts and minds to refuse a polarization which is damaging the United States, the church in the United States, and in some other places like Holland, Brazil, Peru. I read an article about this, which was criticized by Richard McBrien. Interestingly, And I was glad to receive his criticism. I love criticism, believe it or not. Though I always make sure I know where the exit is. Richard said I exaggerated the polarization. The vast majority, he said, of American Catholics actually are pretty central. They may be a bit more sympathetic to a more progressive view or conservative, but he said, don't exaggerate polarization. Now, this came up in a conversation we had last night, and perhaps we got a further nuance, which is that Richard McBrien is right in saying that the most Catholics in this country are not polarized. Most are pretty central. Yet it remains the case that the clergy, or some members of the clergy, perhaps tend towards a polarization. And some members of the laity too, with often dire results.
Another thought, comment? Somebody would go to the microphone. Yes, yourself. Thank you.
I'll just talk about Tom Bedoin and Radiohead. His favorite band is actually Rush, and in his little book on consumerism, the first taste he had with consumerism was going out to buy Geddy Lee's black sneakers. So I thought I should mention that in his honor. But my question is actually, you mentioned this ghetto mentality and the sectarian mindset. I actually just got married to a member of the Church of Christ that is a congregational group that's very prone to sectarianism. And I went to college with a group of Pius X Society Catholics who are Catholic sectarians. And my husband and I both have a lot of friends and members of our own community, people that we care about very much, who have that sectarian mindset. And one of the problems that I see is that the conversation is a great goal, but it's very difficult to find the starting words. It's very difficult to find the common language. It's very difficult to recognize even sometimes that you're part of the same tree. And the difficulty with the sectarian mindset is that you're not really interested in getting the odd birds. You're not interested in the outside world. You don't want to open your leaves. You want to stay enclosed. You want to stay safe. So where do you begin the conversation to show that the open tree with all the odd birds sitting in it is actually better?
Thank you. And that is a real difficulty. Sometimes you can't. If all you can do is to await the moment that a conversation can begin. Sometimes you have to be there, offering friendship, making gestures of openness, but you can't force the conversation to begin if the other person refuses it. I had an instance of this when I read an article which was published in the National Catholic Reporter, and it provoked an extremely violent reaction from a professor from St. Louis University, another Jesuit university, in which he said that I was obviously a heretic, and in fact he said that I was a deceitful person because I was a heretic who concealed my heresy and tried to persuade people that I was really Orthodox. And he produced quotations from me which were invented. He took first part of a sentence from one place and the second part from another. And so I demanded the right of reply, and I wrote a very nice, gentle thing. And then the reply was even worse. You can't force the conversation. You can't make somebody talk. But you have to go on displaying your openness and refusing to be reactive. Because the danger is to become reactive. And then you're the prisoner, in a way, of their discourse. That's the freedom of Jesus, who says, if they strike you, turn the other cheek. It's refusing to be caught up in the violence of their language and to become the prisoner of their way of acting. And one of my brethren, who's died now, Anawati, George Anawati, he founded an institute for dialogue with Islam in 1939 in Cairo. And somebody said, "What do you need?" He said, "Geological patience." Geological patience. And we need that sometimes in our own church. I think if we go back to some of the roots of misunderstanding, the sectarian mindset, as you called it, often is rooted in a sort of fundamentalism which believes that the truth of God and faith can be captured. A sort of literalism. I think we have to recover what actually the great spiritual mystics have never lost, which is a sense that any language about God is a via negativa. It's the destruction of idols. It's always a way in which we demolish one false image of God after another. As you advance into the mystery, the cloud of unknowing. Now, what you nearly always find with any sectarian mindset is that they don't do this. They've got God wrapped up. They know the truth. Therefore, they've no need to search. And that might look like a typical sort of religious sectarian position. My own belief is that, and I'm not a historian, and there are lots of people here who I'm sure know more about it than I do, my suspicion, which you're free to correct, is that that is a sort of religious reaction to a 19th century scientific fundamentalism. You begin at the end of the 19th century to get claims that science can explain everything, that anything only has sense if it's explicable, if it can be articulated in scientific terms. And I guess, and I'm not a historian, I guess that religious people began to say, "Oh, you think you can say it all? No, we can say it all." So you lose that traditional sense of religious discourse as multi-layered. Aquinas knew that when you read Scripture, you could read it as metaphorical, allegorical, literal, all sorts of levels of interpretation. And it's really, I think, only, I would guess, at the end of the 19th century, you begin to get this idea that you can have a simplified, unified, sectarian language of religion in which everything is said and therefore nothing needs to be asked. So I think this is one thing maybe where spirituality in the 21st century will have something terribly important to offer, which is a recovery of that blessed ignorance. That the journey into God is always a journey into the dark, which is also a journey into intimacy. I was talking with I went to the Norfolk State Penitentiary the day before yesterday, spent a day with a Dominican fraternity we have there of prisoners, and it was a fascinating day. And one of them raised this question about conceptions of God. And I used the traditional, very old, I'm sure it's been used a million times, the metaphor of the kiss. When you kiss somebody, you can't see their face. The closer you get to the kiss, the more they disappear. And I think that's the part of the humility of good theology and spirituality. A lot of the sectarian mindset is not exactly humble.
I think we've time for one more.
There's always time for the dean.
For the dean. In fact, we've plenty of time for.
Thank you.
We'll let the dean have the closing comment.
Good.
After, and then Timothy.
Good. It's a question relevant to my position. As you know, at Boston College, there has long been an excellent theology department, and then the Institute operated for many years in the university, and now we have a School of Theology and Ministry operating in the university. And I just would like to call upon your own reflections as someone who has been long associated with Oxford about what the opportunities are for theology in the university, and also maybe even a reflection or two about our little
About
our School of Theology and Ministry just beginning. What would you think are the opportunities, and what do you think are some of the challenges that we will face?
When I began to do my theology, I started off doing it with my Dominican brothers. But as part of our attempt to arrive at ecumenical openness, we required really all our students to do also the university degree in theology at Oxford University. And it was an immensely beneficial experience to have 3 years of doing theology with Anglicans and Methodists and Baptists. I never regretted it. But one challenge I found was that theologians in the context of a big university, well, a prestigious university like Oxford, theologians often lost their confidence. And often they tried to justify their academic position by narrowing down their understanding of theology. So that historians would try and show that they were just as much good objective historians as anybody else. The people doing linguistic analysis would do the same thing. And what I found, my disappointment in Oxford, which I'm afraid still disappoints me, is perhaps a lack of that exploratory, interdisciplinary interaction, which I think is an inherent part of theology, because theology isn't a discipline like any other discipline. But faced with grave professors with very impressive-looking gowns and big hats, theologians often lost their confidence in the context of Oxford, particularly those who weren't Catholic, I'd have to say, and therefore failed to be exploratory and imaginative. So here you have, I think, the great blessing, which we don't have in England. We don't have any Catholic universities. There are no Catholic universities. You have a tremendous opportunity here at Boston and the other 231, I believe, Catholic universities in the United States, of having a context where you should have the confidence of a shared faith to let theology leap across the disciplinary boundaries and have something of its old glory as the queen of the sciences. And that's one of the things I would hope. And that's one of the reasons, I think, why Boston and other great universities can help us find that integration of the Christian life that I mentioned, where spirituality and theology and ethics and philosophy and biblical study come together as part of an integrated living rather than just splintered disciplines.
Thank you, Timothy.